He was so human.
Yeah, he was so human and yet so beautifully godlike, so infinitely loving kindness itself. Yeah.
And Meherwan was there for the birthday.
And Meherwan, of course, was there for that whole period because each year he was given a month's holiday from his work and from Bindra House and his work there for Baba, which was continuous. Meherwan was and is so much close Mandali, even though he was not physically there, and yet
like Nariman and Mayurji.
Like Nariman and Mayurji, so close to Baba, and it's so beautifully summarised, you could say, his position when Baba at the beginning, before Baba departed on the new life, and of course Meherwan wanted to be with him, and Baba said, Meherwan, I'm taking Erich to look after me, and I'm leaving you to look after the family, because again it is so clear how dear the Jesawala family was to Baba. Well, I mean, one thing is even sufficient to convey that, and that was that him saying that Gaimai, Erich and Meherwan's mother, would be his mother when he came again in 700 years. In other words, she would be like Chiranmai, Baba's mother, this time, in this Advent. Yeah. Yeah, so the birthday, so Baba, at 6 a.m. Baba came, carried over as I told you, and with this shawl.
Yeah.
And it was a cold morning. And it was so clear that he felt it. But he came and then sat and we all sang happy birthday, and after the singing of the birthday, as I was directed, I went to the decorated canopy that had been created over Baba's chair where he was seated, and hanging in the middle was a big balloon, blown up, apparently a big blown up balloon. And I was directed, I was not... Right over Baba's head. I was not told anything about it. I was simply told would I please puncture that balloon, and the singing of happy birthday with the singing. And so I did, and in bursting, a whole shower of petals, rose petals, flooded over Baba. It was a beautiful moment.
Any particular colour or just all?
No, just different colours. But there must have been so many, and the patience they must have had to open the neck of the opening of the balloon and putting in petals in such a way that the petals were not all just crushed. Yeah.
Now, let me just ask you a sequence here, because you said, first of all, they said Avatar Maribaba
Ki
7
Jai.
times.
Yeah. And then prayers were
Was
said.
that all at the 6 o'clock in the morning?
No, that was at 5.
Oh, okay, so,
I said that.
okay, I didn't get it.
No.
So Avatar Maribaba,
Yes, and the prayers, and then the songs of love for God,
yes,
and the arties were played.
yes.
They had been recorded and they were played on records.
So between 5 and 6, what happened to Baba? Did he stay there?
He was with the women, and the women.
Oh, so when you said Avatar Maribaba Ki Jai 7 times, Baba wasn't there?
No,
No, okay, I'm getting it, sorry, it's taken so long.
yeah.
Okay, so.
Sorry, I should have clarified that. No, we were there. We gathered there.
Gathered.
Yeah, and Barbara was with the women. As Barbara said at one point in the early in the morning, that all his birthday meant for him was that he was wakened early and have his face washed. It was a reflection. What a tender moment. What touching words that God-man. It reflects his physical condition after, as I've said, a lifetime of such incredible service. How you could say that over, well, at that point, what was it, 47 years, 48 years, 40, something like that, of daily crucifixion, of suffering because of our lack, our state of ignorance and our lack of love for God and love for God in each one of us. In other words, the lack of sense of brotherhood, of oneness that we had then and still have. But by His grace, there will be a change, and there will be an awakening that we'll all, as Barbara said at one stage, when the whole world says, "Oh God, help us, oh God," He will. Yes, and so the birthday, and then he departed back to have breakfast as normal, and we had a delicious breakfast at that time. And then again he returned at 8 a.m. And that day was, morning and afternoon was spent so much listening to cables and messages of love for Barbara, happy birthday messages.
You got the chocolates in the morning?
And we got the chocolates in the morning. Yeah. Yeah. Very nice. And it was a joyous day.
I tried to listen to Harry Kenmore's.
And we try, yes. And then in the evening, Barbara had been told that Harry was seeking to have a worldwide broadcast of their celebration of his birthday in New York. And so Barbara had a cloth drawn across diagonally across Mundley Hall, so that So the Mundley Hall was divided in two. This curtain stretched across from wall to wall at an angle. So on this side was Barber seated as usual in his chair, and the men Mundley and myself were on this side, and on the other were the women. But of course we could not see them. And we gathered there in the hope that we would hear the broadcast, but which we didn't. It just didn't occur.
It wasn't meant to be.
It wasn't meant to be. But then after that, I was sent after the evening meal. I was driven into Abednego, where the Barber lovers had organised a grand procession.
Wow.
Barber's birthday. That was that evening, and they had a bullock cart with a huge photograph of Barber. It was all beautifully decorated, and was taken through the streets with singers and dancers, the Barber lovers, and of course all the inhabitants of the city lined the streets. It was an incredibly grand affair. For myself, I was so tired after the day already that I did walk with Sarosh Irani, one of the close Mundley, and Adi Senior.
Is that in that picture of the three?
Yes, of the three of us
Oh.
was taken at that time. And I walked with them for a period, and then I didn't have their stamina. I didn't have the stamina of the close Mundley. Nowhere near. God, what a contrast. And so I was driven back. I don't know, if I remember rightly, I was there perhaps a couple of hours.
Quite some time though.
Yeah, yes, it was some time.
Yeah.
And then Barber asked me in the morning, did I? And I said, yes, Barber. Yeah. But again, I was inarticulate to be able to say very much.
Yeah, you couldn't describe it.
You couldn't describe it. The opportunities I had that I wasn't able to express myself when I was with Barber. But Barber was so kind and put up with me. J. Barber. J. Barber. You remember that I spoke about Barber giving a message for each person who was at that time particularly involved with Avatar's Abode. But in addition to that, he also spent some time, a little time, on Joan and my health. Not the children, but because there was actually nothing wrong with the children, but spoke about Joan's tendency to withdraw, and Barber commented that she was depressed, and he directed that she should have B12 injections, and that she should also go out at least once a month as an outing, go out of the house, as it were, on some social outing, or which could include going to the movies. And with myself, I was at the time very thin, thinner than I am now. And I had been very active, and Barbara directed that I should eat, that I should have more protein, and particularly mentioned meat, but also eggs, fish, eggs, cheese, protein.
Did he mention once a day or how often?
No, he didn't. Just simply that I should definitely have more protein. But as it was at the time, I was virtually, really vegetarian, and obviously, again, not eating enough.
Yes.
But
and a lot of cigarettes and tea.
yeah. Anyway, Barbara showed that loving concern for our health.
Is this also the time he asked about cigarettes?
Oh yes, that's right. That's right. I'd forgotten. Yes, he also, in talking to me about having more protein, suddenly said, "How many cigarettes a day do I smoke?" And I said, "A little less than a pack a day," which was true, because I had always tried to discipline myself in terms of the number of cigarettes that I had. And Barbara, what was so wonderful was that Barbara looked at me and didn't say yes and didn't say no. And my definite, there was no question that it was clear to me that it would be best and important that I give it up when I judged the time to be right.
But he didn't say anything.
No, he did not indicate at all. But I can remember him looking at me steadily, just looking at me, and there. And a few years later, I did, because it was on my mind that in order to be as effective as possible in my work for Barbara, that I was to look after my health.
And you got quite sick too.
And I was again overdoing it, and I had at the time a severe attack of bronchitis, and I realised this was an indication to me that it was high time. And it was interesting, I had no difficulty in giving it up. And I even had a dream a week later, after I had finished smoking. I had a dream in which I was offered a cigarette, and I said in the dream, "I know I've given them up." Yeah, and then at the same time, it may have been the same time, I'm not sure. But again, Barbara then questioned what I was earning, how much I was earning. And it's always been difficulty for me to, at that time, to be, I was not on a regular income, I was a consultant. So it fluctuated.
Commission work.
Yes, and I was not at all sure, but it wasn't very good of me not to know, not to be clear about how much I was earning. And Barbara then ordered that I should earn $5,000 a year. And I'm sorry, I'm now vague as to whether that was 5,000. I'm sure that in America, in India at that time, currency, overseas currency, was dollars. I know we changed over near that, around that time. Anyway, 5,000.
Yeah. And didn't he ask you how much you saved?
And yes, and then asked what reserves I had. And I said 4,000. It was dollars. That's right. Dollars had come in at that time, and it was $5,000. That's right. I remember now. And I said I had 4,000 reserve, and there was a bit of a gasp around amongst the men Mundley, on the basis that that was not very much
For a life saving.
for life savings. Actually, at that time, I think if I remember rightly, I'd only just paid off the debt that I owed from taking the family to Barber in '62, as he ordered that we had to go. So I had to borrow the money. And okay, nothing more was said. That was at that time. That was all that was said about money, and then later in the 14 days I was with him. I'm not sure. Again, all I know is that it was definitely later in my stay, and Barber. There wasn't discussion about money. Must have been discussion with regard to Avatar's abode, which of course it was, I'm not saying each day and every day, but there was a lot of talk about, and Barber's emphasis to me to carry out 100% what he told me to do.
And you didn't really think about how much that would cost?
No, it never occurred to me. I just said yes, Barber, with regard to the development of Avatar's abode. And suddenly, unexpectedly, Barber looked at me and said, "If you need money, come to me and I will see to it." And I said, "Yes, Barber." But as it were, it went through my mind what a loving gesture it was. The thought was, you could say that it was like a loving father to his son. If you have a medical expense or a dental that you're having difficulty to meet, come to me and I'll help you. It was no more than that. I had no idea what would result. But that was Barber's turning of the key in that respect. The turning of the key which he had done for me was in relation to spreading his name and message. As I told you, the difficulty that I had of achieving response in Australia, no matter how little response had come from the efforts that I'd made to spread his name and message, and I think I recall.
I'd like you to go over that again, because I can't clearly remember if you've talked about
Right.
what Eric told you to say to Bob.
Yes.
When you said Eric.
Yes.
told me that.
Well, the awareness of Barber's, the awareness of Barber's comments that everywhere there's a flame of love for developing, but not in Australia.
When did he say that?
That was very early in the piece, right in the beginning. That was, as it were, the beginning
Of the 67.
of that '67 stay, that and the direction that Francis should hand Avatar's Abode over to me, and that I should develop it as a place of world pilgrimage. And that directive, the emphasis that Baba placed almost day by day of carrying out 100% of what he had asked me to do, was weighing heavily on me. And one evening, I can remember so clearly, that I was sitting with Erich and Francis. We were writing down whatever Baba had approved or directed that day, and I said to Erich, I said, you know, Erich, it's so clear to me that it's clear that I'm not the man that Baba needs in Australia. I was conscious at that time of having not achieved, to my mind, nothing of what Baba had asked to be done.
And certainly Baba was expressing that to you.
Yes. And Erich said, speak up, tell Baba. Speak out and tell Baba. If it hadn't been for Erich's clear, emphatic statement to do so, I wouldn't have done it. I would have, of course, come back to Australia and endeavoured to carry on as Baba had directed. But with Erich's encouragement, I said to Baba, first thing in the morning, I can remember the following morning, as we then sat, after Baba had walked up and down and sat in his chair, I was there, and I said, Baba, I feel like that I'm not the man that you need. You need somebody better to carry out the spreading of your message. And Baba looked at me and simply gestured that the turning of the key, which I was, of course, I was.
Do that again. Right. Okay. That's what
It was just as you would grasp a key and you turn it.
Right. Okay.
Do you follow me?
Yes. Yeah.
And Baba looked at me and made that gesture, and there were no words said, but it was of course absolutely clear what Baba had done. And yes, there was what could you say in that moment? In that moment there was just that moment of profound silence.
Erich didn't say.
No, there was nothing said. There was silence. And then, after some moments, as it were, then the morning continued. The session with Baba then carried on, and I don't remember what. Yes. And and it was towards, again, did I cover what Baba about the money? Did I cover then that Baba suddenly looked at me and said, if you ever need money? That was on another occasion, again towards the end of my stay. And Baba again, there was no discussion. I know I've mentioned this, but I'll repeat it because it was so interesting that he gestured, if you ever need money, come to me and I will see to it. And I took it as a gesture of a loving father for some little expense. I didn't realise that would open up so much my financial history. You could say, in a sense, from then on, because what was so strange was that despite an incredible increase of barber activity, with so many people as a result of Barber turning the key, there was an incredible flurry of activity, barber activity, you could say, in Australia. And yet, despite that, I was still able to earn the necessary money. But the real movement of that directive of barbers was when we returned. That is, the whole group of Australians returned from the last darshan of 1969. And I happened to say to some of the young ones who had been doing extra activities such as jewellery, moccasins, leather belts, trying to earn extra money from handcraft items in order to get to be with Barber, to enable them to finance their trip to India. And I said to them, why not come together instead of being individual, one here and one there, come together. And I had I had never been in business. I knew nothing of business really. But as it were, I may have had what you may call a vague idea of a cooperative, of people coming together, working together for a common objective. For myself, I thought if through helping them and I'm able to earn a few extra dollars myself, it'll go towards Avatar's abode. My objective was always over those years, and particularly since 67. So strongly was my direction to develop, as Barber had directed, Avatar's abode as a place of world pilgrimage. Yes, well that really is the finish of 67 until the final day. Yes.
Allura.
Yes. Then towards the end again of the stay, Barber directed that I should go with Francis and Donkin to Allura. That was, as it were, the 15th day. And on the 14th day, I can remember leaving Mundley Hall.
That's when you said goodbye to him.
Yes, and with Mayawan. We both went out of Mundley Hall. And as we departed, we bowed to Barber. And I can remember, and it's vivid in my mind now, that at the time I had the absolute clear conviction that this was simply a temporary goodbye, and that there was no embrace, there was no physical contact with him, but I had the clear sense of departing from him to carry out what he'd asked me to do, and that then I would return and as it were receive an embrace from him then of having achieved, or having put my that he was an embrace of the degree of satisfaction in what I had the energy I had put into what he'd asked me to do. It was curious. The image that came to me at that time, or as I was leaving, was simply leaving him, going round the corner, as it were, going out of the building, going round the corner, carrying out what he asked me to do, and then be back with him. There was absolutely no sense, and never has been any sense of finality. That there's no doubt in my mind that I'll be with him again when he returns in 700 years. And I can only hope and pray that I'll be a better worker for him then than I have been during this Advent.
Well, but say, to continue, so when you returned to Australia,
yes.
what happened?
Yes, that was the curious part. I told you about the turning of the key. Well, astonishingly, the day I arrived back, I got a phone call from the nephew of an old barber lover, a long-time barber lover, I mean, in America, Louis Agostini. Yes, that's right. And he had sent word to his nephew, who had been, he was not a barber lover, but he knew of Meyer Barber, and he was endeavouring to establish a printing press, and he was also acting as a freelance journalist. And he rang me and said that would I agree to an interview with him on Meyer Barber, and of course I was delighted. And that was the beginning. That article did appear in a national paper, The Australian, which was published in each of the states. And that seemed to awaken the interest of certain journalists who also wrote feature articles or articles on particular topics of that time. And as a result, I got interviews with a number of newspapers, state newspapers, and they were surprisingly fair and even-handed in their reporting. What is curious, of course, looking back on my own history, is that although I was not a gifted public speaker at that time, I was not prominent, in any social sense, but I did happen to have that degree in psychology, and I was operating as an independent psychologist, a consultant to companies with regard to the appointment of their executives, or the assessing of their staff. And for whatever reason, all I can say is it would seem to me that because at that time there weren't that many psychologists, and there weren't that many psychologists, certainly. In fact, there were none others that were suddenly prepared to say that yes, God is alive and well and working in behalf of mankind in India. And this, of course, constituted interesting news, and that was as a result. The articles were quite big and had photographs. It was very satisfactory. And at the same time, again because of Barber's turning of the key, well, incredibly, instead of the situation prior to 67, when I was in effect knocking on doors and saying, "Can I tell you about Meher Baba?" I had people knocking on my door saying, "Please tell us about Meher Baba." It wasn't only young, but there were a lot of young ones. A lot of the alternative, the musicians, the artists, the young ones who were at that time questioning the status quo, the hippie culture. There was a lot of that, but there were also the older ones that also, and that was particularly evident when I gave my first public talk in I think it was June, if I remember rightly, it's June 67. It was certainly perhaps a few months. Yes, perhaps, what would that be, March, April, May, 3, 4 or 5 months after Barber, I had my first big public meeting in Melbourne, and about 200, I'm told. The hall was full. It was a large hall, and I was told that meant about 200 people. And the talk that I had prepared, which I read in those days, I was not able to talk just naturally about Barber. I had to write what I gave out. And that was read to Barber. And Barber sent me a most encouraging message saying that it had been read to him and that it was entirely satisfactory, and that it didn't matter whether 1 or 1,000 came.
So he read it before the meeting?
Before the meeting. And that was definitely attended by many older people who then subsequently did travel to India during the 70s to be with the Mandali and learn more about Barber. Yeah, and that continued over the 2 years, particularly during those 2 years. Very, very strong, hectic, active days. There were constantly constantly meetings and radio interviews, newspaper articles. There was also at that time TV. The first one was the national broadcaster, the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission. They approached me as a result of the articles that appeared in the newspapers, and I had a short interview in which again I was simply asked about my understanding of the status, the spiritual status of Meher Baba, and I said that he was God in human form. I was told by others that listened that it was satisfactory. That's all I can say. I felt I can remember that whatever nervousness I may have felt before, I didn't feel at the time.
That's good.
Yeah.
And their house was active now too.
Yes. One interesting thing that occurred, can we break it at that point?
Okay.
Just break. Jai Baba. I broke then because an interesting incident that occurred during those 2 years. In other words, I was with Baba in February 1967, from the 14th to the end, 14th to the 28th. And Baba dropped the body in, as you know, in January the 31st, 1969. So it was just a period of 2 years. And you remember that I said that the first directive that Baba said was, Francis, hand Avatar's abode over to Bill. And that I was to form a trust when I considered that the time was ready. Now, about 3 months after I left Baba, Francis wrote to me. Of course, I'd been in touch. Baba had said to write to him to report, but I also wrote to Francis, and Francis would write to me. And in a letter from Francis, he said, why go to the bother of transferring the Avatar's abode, the property, to me? Why shouldn't I form a trust immediately? Instead of handing it over. It was right in the midst of an intense period of work, of activity that was occurring at that time. As I've said, the young ones, I was having meetings, I was having newspaper articles, TV program was coming up, and my immediate reaction was, without thinking, I wrote to Francis in effect saying, Francis, for heaven's sake, I'm flat out. Get off my back, in other words, desist. And this, as it happened, was read to Baba. And so I then received now remember that Baba had acknowledged me, had accepted me as one of his workers. That's really, as I understand, the best thing I can say with regard to Baba saying in the very beginning, the first thing that he said to me in '67 was, Bill looks like one of the Mandali. in other words, he accepted, as I understand, he accepted me as one of his workers. And so my letter to Francis was then read to Barbara, and this was written from, it was late in '67. Francis wrote to me with what Barbara had told him to write. Barbara says he knows everything and he does everything. Do not be confused. Remember Barbara's instructions. Do your best and Barbara will help you. Barbara says that soon an opportunity regarding Barbara work will arise. Grab it with both hands without thinking about how it will affect your job. That does not mean that you should give up your present job, but means that when this opportunity of Barbara work comes, don't try to earn more money at the cost of the opportunity.
Wow.
This was...
That's amazing.
That was... Then Barbara dictated the following.
You just keep reading. I'll just see. Keep going.
Dear Bill, this is what Barbara dictated, apparently. This is the precise words. Understand once and for all time that as far as Australia is concerned, Francis stands first and last, and you are his right hand. So keep him informed of new developments and always seek his advice when necessary. And signed Barbara. Barbara then added, I want you to tell me clearly whether you will try 100% to carry out my instructions. After my reply that I wish for nothing more than to do his bidding, Barbara dictated the following letter. Your letter of 29th October made me very happy. You have not disobeyed me in the least, and I am not displeased with you in the least. On the contrary, I am pleased with you. Continue to try as you have been trying, and soon an opportunity will arise which will make you also happy. You can expect a breakthrough in December. Remember all my instructions and do all my work, but not to the extent of overlooking